Nobody told me before the wedding, not my mother, not his mother, not the bishop, not the women who filled my kitchen with food in the weeks after and assessed whether I was functioning correctly. Nobody sat me down and said, "Hannah, here's what your husband is permitted inside your marriage. Here's what the church allows. Here's what the Ordnung expects you to receive." I learned it the way women in my community learned most things. By living inside it until the shape became clear. It took me 3 years to understand the full outline of what I had walked into. It took me 8 more to find the door. My name is Hannah. I was raised Old Order Amish in Wayne County, Ohio. I married at 19. I left at 28. I share what I lived through because the silence around these things was not accidental. It was structural, it was maintained, and it cost women in my community things they are still counting. What I am describing today is not about one man. It is about a system, about what that system explicitly permitted, what it implicitly endorsed, and what it made impossible to name from the inside. I want to be careful. I want to be precise. Different Amish districts operate differently. What I describe is what I lived, and what women from 4 other communities confirmed to me in private. Subscribe if you are new, stay for all of it. This is the video I have been working up to for a long time. To understand what an Amish husband is permitted, you first have to understand the doctrine of headship. Headship is not a metaphor in the community I came from. It is not a spiritual concept applied loosely to ordinary life. It is the operating architecture of the marriage, total God-ordained and non-negotiable. The husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. That sentence, repeated from childhood, from sermon, from the quiet instruction of mothers and aunts and bishops' wives, produced a very specific understanding of what marriage meant. It meant the husband decided about the farm, about the money, about travel, about visitors, about how the children were raised and disciplined and educated. About when the family moved and where they moved to, about which relatives were welcome in the house, and it meant something else. Something that was never stated directly in the sermons but was understood by every wife in the district without needing to be stated. It meant the husband's authority extended into the bedroom, into the body, into every dimension of the private life of the marriage. That authority was not framed as permission. It was framed as covenant, and the difference matters because a covenant cannot be revoked the way a permission can. A covenant is sacred, permanent, something a good woman upholds even when upholding it costs her. The first thing I learned after my wedding was about access, not a conversation about it, not a negotiation, just the lived reality of what marriage meant in practice, that my husband's access to my body was understood. By him, by the church, by every woman who had counseled me before the wedding, as a settled matter. A wife's body was part of the covenant. The covenant had been made. The question of access was therefore already answered. I did not know this precisely before I married. I knew it in the vague way you know something when it has been transmitted through silence rather than language, as an atmosphere rather than a fact. The first time I was tired. The first time I was unwell. The first time something in me said not tonight, and I discovered that not tonight was not a phrase I had been given permission to speak. That was when the atmosphere became a fact. My husband was not aggressive, he was not threatening, he simply did not understand that there was another option. He had been raised to believe that a wife's refusal was not a boundary, it was a failure of duty, a spiritual problem requiring patience on his part, not accommodation. He waited, and his waiting was its own kind of pressure. And I learned in that first year that the path of least resistance and the path of least harm were the same path. And I walked it. The second thing was about money. In the community I came from, financial control rested entirely with the husband, not because this was discussed or decided, it was simply the way things were, as settled as the direction of sunrise. My husband managed every dollar that came into the household. I did not have a bank account. I did not have access to the farm accounts. When I needed something, for the house, for the children, for myself, I asked. Asking was not always refused, that is important to say. My husband was not deliberately punitive with money in the early years. But asking is not the same as having, and the distance between those two things, between needing to ask and simply having, is a distance that shapes everything. It shapes what you say and what you do not say, what you need and what you decide not to need because the asking feels too costly, what you know about your own life and what you remain deliberately ignorant of because ignorance is easier to maintain than knowledge you cannot act on. I did not know what the farm made, I did not know what we owed. I did not know, when I finally left, whether there was anything in the accounts or nothing. I left with the money I had hidden, over 8 months, in small amounts, in a place he did not know to look. That hidden money was not savings, it was survival. The third thing was about movement. I could not go anywhere without my husband's knowledge, and in most cases his approval. This was not a rule written anywhere. It did not need to be. It was enforced by the community itself, by the expectation that a wife's movements were her husband's business, that an unaccounted absence was a matter for concern, that a woman who came and went freely was a woman whose husband had lost his governance of the household. In practical terms, this meant that my social world was managed, who I could see, how often, for how long, whether a friendship became too consuming, too much time, too much conversation, too much of a self that existed outside the marriage. I lost 2 friendships in my first 3 years of marriage, not dramatically. They were simply allowed to thin, one missed visit at a time, one declined invitation at a time, until they were gone. I understood, without being told directly, that this was correct. That a good wife's primary relationship was her husband, that friendships which competed with that relationship were friendships that had grown in the wrong direction. Isolation was not called isolation. It was called right ordering of priorities. The 4th thing was about correction. The Ordnung permitted a husband to correct his wife. I want to be precise about what correction meant, because the word carries very different weights depending on where you stand. At its lightest, correction meant instruction, a husband telling his wife she had done something incorrectly and directing her to do it differently. This was ordinary. This was considered part of headship, a husband's responsibility to guide his household toward right conduct. Further along the scale, correction meant discipline. Withdrawal of warmth, extended silences. The removal of small privileges, a visit to family, a small purchase, a freedom of movement that had previously been permitted. These withdrawals were never called punishment, they were called consequences. The consequence of a wife who had been resistant, who had not shown proper submission, who had allowed pride or self-will to disrupt the right order of the household. And at the far end, I will say this plainly, because plainness is what I promised, correction could mean physical force. Not in every marriage, not in every district, but the theology permitted it. The scripture was cited, and the community offered a wife who had been struck by her husband very little, that could properly be called protection. When I went to the bishop in my 6th year of marriage, after a correction that had left marks, he told me that a husband's discipline of his wife was between the man and God. Between the man and God. I was not part of that conversation. After the bishop, I went to my mother-in-law. She was a woman I had come to respect, practical, capable, not unkind. She had survived 40 years of her own marriage and had emerged from it with her faith intact and her face smooth. She listened to what I told her. She said, "Hannah, a good wife finds ways to prevent those moments. She does not put herself in the way of her husband's temper." She said it with genuine concern. She was not dismissing me. She was giving me the best counsel she had, the survival knowledge of a woman who had learned over 40 years to navigate around the edges of a man's authority. She was telling me it was my job to manage him, that the correction was something I had the power to prevent, by being more careful, more compliant, more skilled at anticipating what would provoke and steering around it. She was not wrong that this strategy worked sometimes. She was not telling me it was just. She was telling me it was available. Those are different things. I understand that now. There was a woman I will call Deborah. Deborah was in her 60s. She had been married 43 years. She had a stillness about her that I had always read as peace and later understood was something harder won than that. She came to my house on a Tuesday 3 weeks after the bishop visit, without explanation or invitation. She brought a jar of preserved plums and she sat down and she looked at me directly, not at the floor, not at her hands, directly at my face. She said, "I'm not going to tell you what you should do. I'm going to tell you what I know." She said, "There is an organization in Canton. They help women. They do not ask whether you are Amish or English. They do not ask why you need help. I have the number written on a piece of paper inside the jar lid. You do not have to use it, but now you have it." She stood up, she said, "A husband's authority ends where your life begins. I believe that. The church does not teach it, but I believe it." She left the jar on the table and walked out. I sat for a long time after she was gone. I did not open the jar for 4 months. When I did, the number was still there. 2 years after I left, I sat across from a therapist and described the 4 things: the access, the money, the movement, the correction. She listened without interrupting. She said, "What you have described are the 4 primary mechanisms of coercive control. They appear in closed communities and in ordinary households across every culture. They do not require a cruel man. They require a system that grants one person total authority over another and removes every institutional check on how that authority is exercised." She said the genius of embedding this in theology is that it made each mechanism feel sacred. Access became covenant, financial control became stewardship, isolation became right ordering, Physical discipline became correction permitted by God. She paused. She said, "The system did not make your husband a monster. It made him a man who had never been asked to question a single permission he had been given." I thought about that for a long time, a man who had never been asked to question a single permission. That sentence explained everything, and excused nothing. Both at once. My husband was not born knowing he had these permissions, he was handed them. By his father. By the church. By the unwritten ordnung that shaped every man in our district the way it shaped every woman, totally, early, without asking whether the shape fit the person inside it. He was handed authority over my body, my money, my movement, and my correction, and he was never once asked to consider whether a human being should have that much authority over another human being regardless of what a covenant says. He exercised what he was given. That is not innocent. Adults make choices. He made choices. Some of those choices caused harm that I am still accounting for, but the permissions preceded him. The permissions will outlast him. The permissions are what I am naming today, not one man, but the architecture that produced him and the theology that protected everything he did inside our walls. The framework is the thing, and frameworks can be examined, named, refused. That is what I'm doing here. This is an Amish story, but the 4 things I described are not. If you have been in a marriage or a relationship where access to your body was treated as a settled matter, rather than an ongoing question. If money was controlled in a way that made leaving feel practically impossible. If your friendships thinned, one missed visit at a time, until you looked up and the people who might have helped you were gone. If correction was available to the person with authority over you and the institutions around you called it something that made it sound like your fault. Then you know these 4 things. You have lived them without the ordnung. I see you. You were not foolish for not seeing the shape sooner. Shapes are hardest to see from the inside. You were not weak. The framework was wrong, not you. I want to name Deborah. Deborah, you walked into my house on a Tuesday with a jar of preserved plums and a phone number, hidden in the lid, and a sentence that the church had never taught, but that you believed anyway. A husband's authority ends where your life begins. You had been married 43 years. I do not know what those 43 years cost you. I do not know what you arrived at that sentence through. I do not know if you ever used it for yourself. I used it. I opened the jar. I called the number. It was one of the first steps on the road out. What you left on my table mattered. It still matters. Nobody told me before the wedding. I am telling you now. The access was not a covenant right. It was your body. The money was not his stewardship. It was your life. The isolation was not right ordering. It was a wall. The correction was not discipline. It was harm. You are allowed to name all 4. Naming them is where the door begins. If one of the 4 things I described today is something you have lived, leave the number in the comments, 1, 2, 3, or 4. You do not have to explain. I will know. So will everyone else reading. If you need the number Deborah gave me, the kind of number she gave me, there are resources in the description below. You do not have to be Amish to use them. You only have to need them. Subscribe. The next video is about the morning I left. What I took, what I left behind, and the one thing I did not expect to feel when I reached the end of our lane for the last time. That story is ready. I will see you there.